But we're wrapping up our series called What Keeps You Up at Night? And for the last few weeks, we've been looking at fear. So I thought I would start out with a story. It's actually a historical story, it's true, about the ship, the Essex. Are any of you guys familiar with the Essex? High school kids, if you had to read Moby Dick, you know who the Essex is. It's actually the whaling ship that was what the inspiration for Moby Dick was. Now, the Essex took off about 1819 from Nantucket on a whaling expedition. It was back in those days where they did fish for whales. And they went off to their normal whaling grounds, and it wasn't quite working out for them. So they decided to sail further off into the South Pacific. Now, when they reached their destination, they were pretty much it. It was them and the open sea. There was no land around them, no other boats. It was just them. And they'd been at sea for about a year when the captain took some of the other shipmates, and they got in the small fishing boats, and they headed off to fish. Now, while they were off fishing, the crewmates on board looked out, and they saw a giant sperm whale. And the accounts given by the crew said this whale appeared to be more than 80 feet long and wider than their ship, wider than anything they had ever seen. Now, let's look back. This is 1820. Okay, by today's standards, that's scary stuff. But think about back then. They couldn't just call on a radio and ask for help. They were stuck. And as they sat here and watched this whale, the whale got closer and closer, and eventually the whale rammed the ship not once but twice, rendering the Essex helpless. When Captain Pollard and the other guys got back to the ship, they saw a huge hole in the hull. That's hard to say. And they realized that the situation was dire. So they began to unload what supplies they could, what navigational tools they could salvage, and they stuck them in the 3 small fishing boats. Now, once they got into the fishing boats, they had to make a decision. What were they going to do next? Now, Captain Pollard knew that the Marquesas Islands would be their best bet. They were closest, and it wouldn't take them very long to get there, but the crew was against it. You see, the crew had heard that the Marquesas Islands was full of cannibals. And the thought of making it to the island, to unboard, only to be eaten, scared them to death. Now, it didn't matter that they also knew that other sailors had gone to the Marquesas Islands and been just fine. They had traded there, and they had made it home safely. Even knowing that, the crew members told the captain, no, we're too scared. Option 2. It was the trickiest option and the most unsafe. It would be to sail south and hope that the trade winds would catch them and push them into the coast of South America. It would be a long journey, could take them up to 90 days. And Captain Pollard was well aware they did not have enough supplies to make it. They had to make a decision. Would they allow fear to drive their decision, or would they allow faith to drive their decision? Well, if you're familiar with the Essex, you know that they chose to sail south. Eventually, the 3 boats would be separated. Supplies would run out. And the survivors of the Essex, upon being rescued, would tell a tale of cannibalism. You see, the very thing they were afraid of is what they turned to survive. So if the crew of the Essex knew that the Marquesas Islands could actually be safe, why would they allow fear to drive them south to their impending doom? Well, it's the same reason why you and I allow fear to dictate our narrative. You see, The Marquesas Islands was an unknown. There was the what if. But sailing south, they were going to hit land, and it was going to be safe land. See, what they did right there is they took the pen out of the original author's hands and gave it to fear. And you and I, we do that too. We get so wrapped up in our fears that we let it dictate our narrative. We take the pen out of God's hand and we let fear begin to write our story. And we forget that our story all started in the exact same place, in the book of Genesis, and it all starts out the same. Do you guys remember what that is? In the beginning. You see, fear becomes our security blanket. Fear becomes our crutch. And as we wrap up this series, we've talked about all different things that fear does to us. But one of the primary things that fear does to us is it keeps us from faith. Because when we latch on to fear, we forget our faith. And we forget to do the thing that we're ultimately instructed to do. The thing that Jesus told his disciples in John chapter 14, verse 1. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. Jesus is saying this, look, stop being afraid. Stop letting fear and anxiety dictate your lives. Trust in me. That's all you have to do. Now, throughout the Bible, there is one thing, one instruction that is given to us more often than any others. Do you guys know what it is? Fear not. Fear not. Time and time again, God tells us people to fear not, to not be afraid. Yet it's the one thing that we all seem to turn to when things get uncertain. Now, if you and I were to sit down and have a conversation and talk about our vices, our bad habits, of course, I'm going to let you go first because I'm not going to admit to that stuff flat out. But fear is not going to come out first. Most of us don't even think about fear as a vice. In fact, I can think of some things that I think are far worse than that I've done. If you've ever driven with me, you know some of those things happened on my 5-minute drive here from home today, because I still drive like I live in Houston. But the thing is, that's what we do. We allow fear to take over. Fear is the number one reason that we avoid God and avoid what he has asked us to do. It's why we become complacent. It's why we create safe little bubbles around ourselves. And it's why we refuse to relinquish control. It's why we refuse to let the original author write our story. A few weeks ago, I posted on my Facebook page asking you guys to submit your favorite Bible verses, your life verses, so to speak. Do you guys want to know what the number one that was picked was? Does anyone want to guess? This is audience participation. John 3:16 was very popular. It's another book that starts with J. Jeremiah 29:11. You guys know this verse. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, that in and of itself is an awesome verse. I mean, God's flat out saying, look, I know the plans I have for you. I'm not going to harm you. There's hope there. But so many of us cling to this verse as our security blanket. We cling to it as our life verse, but here's the deal. We're reading it wrong. Did you catch that? We're reading it wrong. Because if you look up there, it says, for I know the plans I have for you. That plans word will leave out one really important letter, the S. And we read, for I know the plan I have for you. Well, Craig and I got to talking about this last week when we were working on the new series. You see, so often we see that word as plan because a plan is cut and dry. A plan is from point A to point B. And so many of us need that. We need point A to point B and nothing in between. But God says, I have the plans for you. And guess what? A plan isn't a straight road. It's not from here downtown on Dodge Street. It's the old country back road with all the turns, all the bumps. If you read further in this passage of Jeremiah, if you read the entire passage, you'll realize that God's plans for the Israelites weren't cut and dry. They had been exiled from their homeland. They were being held captive. And God tells them, I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. But the thing was that those plans weren't immediate. It wasn't, I'm going to pull you out of here immediately. In fact, if you read, you'll see that God tells the Israelites that they are to stay where they are and help prosper the very people who are holding them captive. Now, that doesn't sound like a very fun plan. But he tells them, I'm going to take care of you. And 70 years later, they were able to return to their homeland. And those people who were there, they never really got to see that. But God had plans for them. And his plans included for them to stay right where they are and to experience those things, those bumps, those bridges, those forks in the road. His plan meant them not being able to anticipate what comes next. The Israelites needed to let go of their fear in order to trust God. There were going to be trials and tribulations and uncertainty, but those things God uses to draw all of us closer to him, to teach us to let go of the security blanket that fear has become and trust in him. Now, when I was a little girl, like a lot of you guys, I had a security blanket. But it actually wasn't a blanket, it was a towel. And it wasn't like a cute towel, like my youngest son, Felix, is this little towel, and it's a monkey, and he puts it on, and he runs around the house looking like a monkey. No, it wasn't anything like that. It was just a plain white towel. Nothing fancy about it. In fact, it was super old. It had been, my parents had had it forever, and by the time I latched onto it, it was looking pretty rough. But this security blanket, or the security towel, went with me everywhere. If my mom dropped me off at the babysitter's house, I wrapped that around me, and it kept me safe. If I had to meet someone new, because I was awfully shy back then, I would wrap it around me, and it would keep me safe. At night, when I was alone in my bed, that security blanket kept me safe. It kept everything from the outside world out in my 3-year-old mind. But that security blanket, as much as I thought it was helping me, also hindered me. Because that security blanket also kept me from doing the things that 3-year-olds do. I couldn't go swimming in the pool because I wouldn't let go of my security blanket. I couldn't play soccer because the big kids on the field would laugh at me because I had a security towel. No one carries a security towel when you're playing soccer. On my first day of school, I sat outside the door because I wasn't allowed to take my security towel with me. The very thing that I latched onto to keep me safe was also the thing that kept me from living life. And we do that with our fears. We create this security zone because with our fears, we think we can dictate what's going to happen with our lives and keep ourselves safe. But it keeps us from stepping out. It keeps us from stepping out on faith, and it creates a barrier between us and God. But how do we let go of that security blanket? How do we take that towel and throw it in the trash? I want to share 3 things with you today. And they're not just things to do, they're actually prayers. There are 3 prayers that I hope you guys will incorporate into your daily lives to help you let go of the security blanket that fear has become. The first thing, God, grant me a greater view of you. So essentially what you're asking is for God to help you to know him better. A few weeks ago, we had a series called Unboxed, and we talked about all these little boxes that we put God in. And by and large, we all do that. We see God as a taskmaster with all these rules that we need to follow. We see God as heartless sometimes because all these things are going around us, and why doesn't he just stop it? And then there's the warm, fuzzy God. You know, the God who's supposed to make us feel good all the time, and everything's supposed to be like puppies and kittens. And then there's the concierge God. When I ask God for something, he should do it immediately. And it's no wonder why we refuse to trust God if we have this mindset of him. Because when we put him in those little boxes, our view of him is really narrow. John 15, verses 1 and 2 says this, I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more. Now, we have probably all heard about Jesus being the true vine, right? But have you ever really thought about God as being a gardener? I hadn't until I started really looking into this verse for this sermon. Now, a lot of you guys have gardens out at the Wee Garden. I drive past it about every day, and I've seen the progression from when it was just dirt to what it is now. If you go out there now, there's all these plants, and actually I'm quite jealous of all your vegetables out there. But before it got to that point, the gardeners had to till up the earth. They had to prepare the soil. A lot of you guys put in some nutrients and some different things into the garden. And then you planted your plants. Some of them were just seeds, some of them were plants. And then you painstakingly tend to your plants. You make sure they have water. You make sure to remove the bugs. You do all these things for your garden to make sure that it thrives and then it grows. Because if you don't, this is what happens. Can you guys see that? Okay, this is my gardening ability. This is a lavender plant. At the beginning of the spring, I ran across this plant, and I thought it was awesome because I could grow my own lavender. If you ever come to my house, it smells like lavender. I put it in everything. I put it in my coffee. I bake with it. And I thought, I'm going to grow my own lavender because this is going to save me money, and this is going to be easy. But obviously it wasn't. I'm not a very patient person, and so sticking with it to make sure my plant got what it needed didn't really happen. But see, the thing with God is he sticks with it. He's patient. He gives us what we need to quench our thirst. He feeds our souls time and time again. And he does it because, like a gardener does for his plants, God wants his children to thrive. He wants us to grow and be strong, just like the sunflower. See, the sunflower stands tall and proud. And when the storms come, it still stands. It's thriving. And God does that for his children. He makes sure we have what we need to thrive. And if he's going to do that time and time and time again, no matter how many times we may turn away from him, why do we allow fear to take control rather than trust the gardener? When you turn away from him, that's when you lose hope. But I want you guys to think about this. As you look back on your lives, can you ever say there was a point when God wasn't faithful? Not Was there anything you didn't want to happen that happened? Because that's completely different. But was there ever a time when God wasn't faithful? And I'm going to tell you right now, the answer is no. Because he's always faithful and he is always in control. I found this quote the other day, and it says this: "Don't wait for courage. Love alone can move you. Jump. Courage will meet you there." And we've talked about having courage, and courage is great. But so often than not, we need to remember that we need to go ahead and jump because love is greater than courage. And God's love is always there. And God's love is always there to catch us. When you have a greater view of God, you'll realize he's in control and he wants you to thrive. So you can go ahead and jump. He's waiting. He's good. Just trust him and take those risks. The second prayer is this: God, is there anything I need to prune from my life? We all have things in our lives that we could do away with, things that we need to prune. But there's things that we hold on to, going right back to that security blanket. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's a bad habit that you just can't break. We cling on to these things because for us, it's safer to hold on to it than face the fear of what may happen if we let go of it. I can stay in this job that I'm miserable at and that I can feel being led away from because I know if I stay in this job, there'll be food on my table, there'll be a paycheck, I can make my bills. I'm going to stay in this relationship even though I know it's bad for me because at least I won't be alone and I know what's going to happen next. My habit that I keep doing over and over, I need it. I don't know what I would do without it. All these things that we cling on to because they're safe. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You see, God wants us to be fruitful. But we can't be fruitful when we're holding on to the things that are choking our branches and weighing them down. Have any of you guys ever planted an apple tree before or worked at an orchard or anything like that? When an apple tree grows and produces fruit, it doesn't know when to stop. It will just continue to produce fruit. And eventually, that fruit that it's producing will weigh the branches down and keep it from doing anything else. That thing that the apple tree is doing becomes what actually hinders and hurts the apple tree. And so the farmer or gardener or whatever you call someone who works in an orchard has to go out and painstakingly prune the apple trees. Because when it takes away all the excess, the apple tree could be more productive. And that's what God does for us when we allow him to remove those things in our lives that are hurting us. When we allow God to show us those things and remove them, it allows us to be more fruitful. It allows us to do the one thing he's told us to do time and time again, and that's trust in him. Because with all that fruit weighing us down, all those fears, that security blanket, it does one thing to us. It keeps us rooted in one place, and it keeps us from stepping out. It keeps us from having faith. You see, guys, our problem isn't really with fear, because we're pretty good at fear. Our problem is with faith. And faith is trusting in God. trusting that he is there and he wants us to thrive. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you guys about is this. It's my third and final prayer. God, make me uncomfortable. And just by saying that word today, some of you guys got uncomfortable. We don't want to be uncomfortable. We all have our routines that we've fallen into. We all have our safe spots. And we don't like to step out of them. But if we're going to trust in God, if we're going to put aside the fear, if we're going to quit being complacent, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. Yes, I am the vine and you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. How many of you guys are planners? You like to plan out everything. Me too. I like to know as I start my day, this is going to be my task, this is what I'm going to do. Part of that, I have ADHD, so I need a plan so I can stay on task. And part of it is just me being me. I like to be in control. And because of that, sometimes I take on more than I should. Because if I'm in control, I can dictate what's going on. And we all do that. To the point where we know what we're going to do every single day. I'm going to get up, get dressed, take the kids to school, go to work, have lunch, come home, eat dinner, do homework with the kiddos. It's routine. And routines are safe. Routines, we don't have to think about. Routines, we don't have to rely on trust with. But when you're willing to say, God, make me uncomfortable, you're willing to say, God, use me and allow me to draw closer to you each and every day. If we go to the book of Genesis, we find the story of Abraham, also known as Abram back then. And those of you who've gotten to know me know that I love the Old Testament. I just love the imagery in it and the stories. And I love how in the Old Testament, time and time again, God does something over and over and over again. He gets the attention of someone, and then he tells them to go. He basically says, okay, trust me. And he does this with Abraham. God says this to Abraham. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out. At the age of 75, Abram said, yes, God, make me uncomfortable. My dad is 93 years old. He'll be 94. And I think about what it would be like for him just to say, okay, God, I'll pack up and go. He's lived in the same house for 30 some odd years. He has his routine. He goes and has coffee with the World War II veterans once a week. He goes to the same grocery store. He sees the same people day in and day out. He walks to the end of the driveway every single day, and he picks up his newspaper, and he goes inside, actually 4 newspapers. And he goes inside, and he spends the day reading them. And then about 3:30, 4 o'clock, he walks back down the driveway. He checks the mail. He goes back in, and he reads his mail. He has his routine. He has his safe spot. Everything my dad knows is in this one little area in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And at the age of 93, what kind of trust would it take for him to say, yes, God, I'll go? The same kind of trust that Abram had. And the thing with Abraham, not only did God tell him to go, God didn't tell him where he was going. Now, some of you guys won't even go to downtown without explicit directions. You need a map to get there, and you need to know what you're going to do when you get there. And a lot of you, let's be honest, won't even go past 144th Street. You know who you are. But at the age of 75, Abraham says, yes, God, I will go. Lead me. I'm not afraid. I'm going to trust in you. And he leaves everything he knows. He leaves his security blanket behind. And he is faithful. Now, during this time, Abraham and his wife Sarah desperately longed for a baby, an heir. And they had asked God for this time and time again. And God comes to Abraham in a vision, and he says, do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you. Did you hear those words? Do not be afraid. Once again, God is saying, don't be afraid. Fear not. I will protect you, and your reward will be great. And God continues to talk to Abraham, and he tells him, look at the stars in the sky. Can you count them? Because one day, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky. Can you imagine that? Here you are, 75 plus years old. The only thing you've wanted is a baby. And you've done everything God has told you to do. And he's telling you, look, I made you a promise, and I will fulfill it. But the thing is, I have plans, not a plan. And Abraham was faithful. Now, there were times that Abraham did question God and wondered what was going on. But the thing about it was, every time he questioned God, he looked back on his life, and he remembered those times when God was faithful. And that's what you and I need to do, guys. We need to step out of our comfort zones. Say, yes, I trust you. And when the fears start to creep in, that's when we look back and say, yeah, you know what? There never was a time when God wasn't faithful. He has been with me since the beginning, and he has made a promise, and I can trust in that. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Accept those uncomfortable moments. I wish that this would have been a prayer that I came up with, but it wasn't. A friend of mine, when I worked in the Woodlands, Texas, noticed that her life had kind of become complacent. We lived in a place that was referred to as the bubble. If you guys think you don't like going past 144th Street, we didn't leave the bubble. There was no reason to. Everything we needed was within the bubble. And my friend Lisa realized that this complacency, this routine, was pulling her away from God. And so she began to pray daily, God, make me uncomfortable so that I will rely on you and nothing else. And God answered Lisa. God told Lisa, you're going to Rwanda. Okay, there was one issue with this. You don't leave the church in the summer if you're a children's minister like 3 weeks before VBS. Bad idea. But instead of being fearful of everything she was going to come back to, of knowing that she was going to get off the plane and then walk in the church on Monday morning to 2,000 kids and not know what was going on, Lisa was faithful. She said, okay, God, I'm ready to be uncomfortable. And I took Lisa's lead and I prayed this prayer. And for me, proof that God has a sense of humor, it seemed that every time I prayed this prayer, I would find out like 3 weeks later I was moving. 4 times in 4 years. I kind of quit praying it for a little while. But what I noticed is each time that God told me to move and told me to go, I found myself relying less on me and less on that roadmap and more on him. And in every new place, I felt myself opening more to him and realizing, you know what, there were things that need to be pruned from my life. And using those uncomfortable moments as an opportunity to remember that apart from him, I really can do nothing. Because his faithfulness is always there. And because of that, we can let go of the fear and anxiety that controls us and trust him with our future. Now I want to close with showing you guys a picture. This is me climbing a tree at Camp Fontenelle. This picture is actually 2 years ago. I actually had instructions from our staff not to get hurt while I was there, and I actually followed through with that. I'm a rather clumsy person. But tree climbing is the highlight of the week with the kids that we take to camp. We get to do it every day. The camp we go to is called Tree Frog. So that's what we do. We act like tree frogs and we climb. And climbing is a lot of fun. It's actually not too terribly hard. It's easier if you're like 11 years old and weigh 60 pounds than 40 years old and weigh 130 plus. But, you get in a groove, you're in a harness, and you're just working your way up. And then about halfway through, just about everybody does the same thing. They look down. And in that moment, fear takes hold. You're not touching the ground. You're not at the top. You're in the middle. And you grab onto that rope for dear life. And you don't move. Because the fear of falling, not so good. And look how much higher I have to go. Not so good. So you grab hold of that rope, and it becomes your safety net. But there's 2 problems with that. 1, you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. You don't want to go back down because you've already been there, but you're too afraid to go up any higher. You don't have the trust to get to where you need to go. And number 2, you're wasting so much energy clinging onto that rope. You don't realize it because you're in a comfortable, safe spot. But the longer you hold on to that rope, the more energy you're expending. And the more energy you expend, the less you have to get to where it is that he wants you to go. Your fear is like that rope. You're holding on to it. And it's keeping you in place, and you can't get to where he wants you to go. You can't carry on with those plans he has for you. And you're wasting so much energy that you're too tired to even try. So guys, let go of the rope. Ask him for that broader view. Prune away those things he shows you that you don't need in your life, and be willing to be uncomfortable. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for your faithfulness, your undying faithfulness. There's never a time in our lives, and there never will be, where we can look back and say that you weren't there, that you weren't there nourishing us, giving us what we need to thrive. God, as we leave here today, help us to remember to let go of the rope to throw away the security blanket, to let go of that fear that we have allowed to dictate our narrative. And let us put the pen back in your hands, God. Let us remember that your love is so much greater than our fears, and that the only thing we need to do is trust in you, Father.